So, for our second mini lecture, I want to take a small break from quantitative research and discuss what qualitative research. I've asked you to watch the TED Talk by Dr. Bryn Brown called The Power of Vulnerability. And you can see from how she speaks that she is a qualitative researcher. And when she's talking about her amazing research, when she talks about her data, and she uses the word data, but don't think of data as a synonym for numbers. Data were, in terms of her qualitative research, meant words. They were her interviews, the stories, the quotes that she got from the extensive interviews that she conducted. Her analysis was not a statistical analysis like you would do in quantitative data. The qualitative analysis is summarizing themes from this data. This is often done in a more exploratory approach, and as you can see in her example, she thought she was researching connection. And in conducting a very rigorous and systematic qualitative research study, she found that she was actually studying vulnerability. So, let me give you an example of a qualitative study that I have been a part of. Now, qualitative research is often in this exploratory phase when you don't know much. So, I gave you the example in quantitative data of fathers and how we didn't know a lot, but there was some research. Well, this study, this qualitative study that I conducted, came out of that study because we had a few mothers who identified their father as being a social father. So the grandfather was who they said was the father role model in their child's life. And so we went ahead and interviewed them and realized that this is something that's really increasing in prevalence. And so we wanted to know more about the experiences of these grandparents. So we asked the grandfathers if we could interview them. And then we also asked grandmothers. We went through an organization called Grandparents as Parents and expanded our recruitment beyond the father study, where our sample consisted of custodial guardians recruited through this organization. So they had custody of their grandchildren. This was an open ended interview where we were asking them about their experiences. So we had questions that we asked everybody, but we also sort of let the interview guide itself in terms of what they wanted to talk about. For the interviews, we asked them questions about their attitudes, their opinions, their behavior and experiences. In qualitative approach, these can be scripted or open-ended. We sort of took a hybrid of the two. And the analysis, you're assessing the words. So this isn't like putting numbers to an interview, like coding an interview for a quantitative analysis. So, for example, we could have done a quantitative approach where we could have coded the number of times that grandparents say we in referring to them and their child to get at some kind of collective group in their family. We could code the number of positive versus negative statements, but that isn't what we were interested in. We wanted to let the themes emerge of what were consistent themes across these different interviews. I could talk about this for an entire day, but just let me give you a few examples of some themes that came out. We had multiple grandparents talk about their life being put on hold. So, for example, one grandfather said, and they're partying and they drop them off on us. How come we old folks can't go party? We don't want to drag no baby. So they were discussing sort of feeling that they were being imposed upon, that their life was on hold because they were taking care of their grandkids. Many talked about their names being indicative of what their role is with their grandchild. Basically, we do everything just like a father and a son. He looks up to me as dad. That's what he calls me. Another grandfather said, she doesn't even know my name. It's just grandpa. So talking about this connection with the grandchild and through what their name is. We had some themes of complaints. One grandmother said, look here, this is the way motherhood should be. You've got to do this and do that. That's your son. You had him, not us. We love him to death, but you need to do more. And then finally, there was this really interesting theme on discipline. Because if you think about it, for most grandparents, the fun part about being a grandparent is you don't have to worry about discipline as much. You can give them as much ice cream as they want, let them run around and be wild. So it can be hard if all of a sudden you have to play a parenting role with your grandchild. So one grandfather said, it just seems like sometimes you look at him and tell him to do something and you have to turn your head and smile and laugh because he's so crazy. So he's recognizing that he needs to put on a different face in terms of discipline because of his role, his parenting role. So let's sort of wrap this all up. What is the difference between quantitative and qualitative research? Go to the roots. Quantitative research, quantity, that means that it's something that's objectively measured through numbers. This is often through standardized measures versus qualitative, which is non-numerical data. Now, this is often interviews, so verbal data such as words, but there's also some really interesting qualitative research that uses pictures and analyzes different pictures. So, for example, I have a friend who did a qualitative research on children's understanding of death, and it was a cross-cultural approach. So she interviewed some people who were Irish Catholics in Wisconsin, and she also interviewed some children in India. And because it's hard to ask children questions about death, she asked them to draw pictures. One of my favorites was for the Irish Catholic children. There was one child who drew a picture of a funeral that he'd been through, and in the funeral there was a keg because there was sort of this celebration aspect of celebrating somebody's life and how alcohol was part of that. So she was able to look at these different pictures and compare them to sort of come up with themes of what's sort of typical in these different cultures. Okay, so you might be saying, but wait, okay, we've talked about quantitative and qualitative change, so how are these different from that? If you remember with qualitative change, those would be stage theorists who believe that people are qualitatively different from one stage to another, versus quantitative theorists are like behaviorists who it's easy to put a number to what they're interested in. So if you think about Skinner and when he was training the bird to peck, you saw it actually graphing the rate at which this bird is learning to peck when it says peck and learning to turn when it says turn. So if you'll think about it, they're similar in that the quantitative approach to change, where they are think of it as like a slope. Those researchers, those theorists, are more likely to do quantitative research, whereas the qualitative change, where we have stage theorists, you can think of it as sort of steps where there's a qualitatively different shift from one step to another, that might be easier to do with qualitative research. Now, I don't want to confuse you. We can see qualitative and quantitative research being used for the opposite, but in general, that's a good way to remember it. Quantitative research makes sense with quantitative change. Those are the behaviorists who are looking to quantify things and they have that nice linear approach, versus qualitative research, which are interested in things that might come out through qualitative change. So that wraps up the difference between quantitative and qualitative research. Feel free to ask me any questions about this. I know this can be confusing for students.